Once upon a time, there was a little pig who grew up in the marketplace. She had a good enough life. Her masters fed her well, and she had brothers who romped and played with her for a time. She enjoyed watching the humans roaming the streets outside of their comfortable little home. Her greedy, beady little eyes couldn't get enough of the various sparkling and shining items that came and went from the tables surrounding her pen. Being the smallest of the piglets, she would sometimes slip through the wooden bars of the fence and trot through the festive streets, mostly unnoticed. Sometimes on her travels, she would find exquisite scraps, delicious morsels left behind into the wayside. These she would gather for her dear brothers. They would snort and gobble them up while listening eagerly to the stories she'd tell them of the things she'd see in her travels. After a time, the scraps became expected, and the grateful grunts and attentive audience turned to disgruntled complaints of never enough. And even when she brought back plenty to be shared among them in the hope they'd be satisfied, the time was often spent wrestling and squealing over who got what. The smallest piglet's stories lost and forgotten in the noise the others made. Soon she gave up her telling altogether, choosing to remain quiet while watching them wrestle about for the bits they wished to consume. As they grew larger, she remained small, often giving up her portion to appease the growing hogs. Over time, the once joyful piglet became less and less so. Her daily adventures turned to harrowing searches for sweet and savory scraps to ward off the abuse of the others. For weeks, this went on without promise of change, until one day, the small pig returned with her scraps to find an empty pen. Dazed and confused, the hungry sow chewed through the treasures she'd found until well after sundown, all the while wondering what might have befallen the sounder of swine. How could an entire parcel of boars disappear? It seemed highly unlikely. She roamed the border of the fence line, sizing it up. She was half the size of the smallest of them, and even she had to squeeze and wriggle through the fence in order to escape. It made no sense. There was no sign of a scuffle or misplaced dirt to insinuate they dug their way out. Nothing seemed out of sorts. The next morning, she overheard the master of the pasture and pig run making arrangements with another of his kind. Now, during her travels, the clever young sow had learned a thing or two over their language. She knew enough to understand that her siblings were unlikely to ever return. She squealed and lamented over the bunch and refused to touch a smidgen or slob of grain. For days, the sad little sow wasted away, refusing to eat partially out of confusion, still at a loss over the trick her brothers had pulled. It was clever, and over time and as the scraps had become their sole reason for breathing, it seemed, they'd become less so. So how in the marketplace had they managed to completely stump her? The other part of her appetite had wasted away for loneliness and loss of good reason to stray from the pen each day. Her hunger all but disappeared, and in the rare occasion she should decide to eat, the layer of slop left over served as a heaping reminder that she was all alone. The sleepless nights spent wrestling and nestling her way deeper into the straw didn't make matters any better. It was nearly impossible for her not to catch herself looking at the empty spaces once kept by the only other pigs she'd ever known. all the while wondering what had become of them. Often hoping they'd somehow learned to forage for their own scraps. But sometimes, deep in the night, she'd catch herself angry and frightened, frustrated that they'd continued to play their joke for so long. By the time the sun yawned into the streets, along with the feet of so many living beings there to buy, sell, trade, and take away, she'd rustle and trot, snorting and snorting to the fence's edge to sit, wondering when they would return for her. After a few days of this behavior had passed, the little pig woke from exhausted dreams to the smell of something unlike anything her little snout had ever sniffed. The succulence, the savor. A sudden hunger awakened inside of her. For the first time in days, to the little sow's amazement, her appetite returned with a vengeance. Her mouth watered ferociously as she rushed from the hay. She oinked eagerly at the fence line until the master of the sty took note. He stepped away from the sizzling and spitting cast-iron pan, roasting the crack-poppling delectables that had all but resurrected her hunger pangs. The merchant chuckled, shaking his head. "Pigs, aren't they the darndest beasts?" Nonetheless, his hope of the forlorn animal was rekindled. Perhaps she'd be worth her weight after all. When he'd finished the batch of mysterious delectables, he poured the sizzling oils over the grain she'd left untouched for days. Without a second thought, the little pig had torn into the slop, and that was that. After she'd filled her belly, life seemed to return back to normal, as well as it could anyway. The curiosity over the disappearance of her brood slightly subsided. Her sadness was slightly more subdued by this new food. With it came feelings of nostalgia. That night, she dreamt of hide-and-seek games first played when the pen still seemed massive to all of them. She woke surrounded in joyful echoes of squeals shared between she and her long-lost companions. As the sun poured into the marketplace, followed by a stream of feet, paws, hoofs, and claws, the little sow breathed it in deep. Determined, she marched the perimeter of the pen, again sniffing for clues to how the boorish bunch had made their brilliant escape. After not so long, the pungent aroma of this sizzling, crackling goodness screamed through the open air. It devoured her attention the moment the steam of it met her little snout. The sow again followed her nose to the fence, closest to the master's station, where he stood with his back facing the little oinkling. At first, he remained unaware of her approach. He was conversing with a fellow merchant the small pig had seen many times before. They were laughing, which piqued her curiosity further. It was one of her favorite noises they made. The interaction calmed her grunts and squeals long enough to listen. "It's the strangest thing," the master was saying, scratching his head. "I tried for days to get the tiny mite to eat even a bite. It was like she somehow missed the rest of 'em. What a silly thought, I know." "The irony," the other tossed in. The two laughed again. Over what? The little pig wished she knew, though her greedy snout was more concerned about the ingredients searing and popping and hissing perfect bliss to bite at her grumbling stomach. Her hungry squeals returned full force, turning the two men toward her. "See what I mean?" the master cried out, pointing. His companion chuckled, shaking his head and crossing his arms over his chest. So unnatural! What a strange, strange thing! To further prove his point, the merchant lifted the hissing cast iron from the fire pit. Well, a bit of grease can't hurt anything at least, right? Aye, mate, just proves pigs'll eat anything. A good way to get rid of excess grease, but, well, at this rate, you'll get your money's worth at least. Again, he shook his head before turning away. Blinded by her stomach, the gleeful sow got lost in the sauce as she sucked down the saturated, savory grain. The rest of the conversation went unheard. They made their deal, shook their hands, and moved on, each to his own business, for the day. And, for a period, time flew by. The little sow grew and grew and grew, until one fine late spring morning she awoke to a new commotion. The sound of deep and wild squealing saturated the pen outside the fortress of hay she'd been fast asleep in. Time had lulled her into lazy conditions, as one might expect for one living alone in a comfortable pen, where all things are provided as needed. The sound sent her flying as quickly as her fat little body would allow. She flung herself from the station of straw. With a squeal of joy, she emerged to a scene much different than the one she'd been expecting. Yes, there were new additions, but these boars were nothing like her siblings had been. She blinked her eyes rapidly. She'd remembered them to be large, yes, but these beasts were a different breed altogether. They looked mean. They smelt mean, and she could see in their eyes the moment they caught her in their sights that they viewed her as the weakest link. She shied away from them as they fought over her precious grain. Whenever feeding time arose, the savvy little sow waited in the shadows, biding her time until the frenzy died down. Once the others quieted and fell into a comfortable sleep, she'd trot her way to the trough, where she found a familiar, scarce pecking of slobber-coated grain. For the first time in weeks, she again lost her appetite. That night, she snorted sadly under the cover of her hump of hay, remembering only the rosy things of what had been, while wondering what was to become of everything rising to meet her. Again, the marketplace felt less like home, and a tiny inkling began to form in the back of the little sow's mind. I wonder where those pesky brothers of mine went off to. Where might they have found that could inspire them to stay away from the only place they'd known to be home? It had to have been divine to keep them from the scraps they'd come to love. For the first time in her life, the little pig thought to leave the only place she'd ever known. She began to wonder what she might find at the other side of the colorful walls of the marketplace. The woman of the woods paused, laughing at the expression of horror stretched over Chester's face. He blinked as if coming awake from a daze, and studied Grandy's face for the first time since she'd started the story. Grandy, how awful! You mean to tell me? He paused again, shaking his shaggy head. Ooh, I can see why you said not to tell Nessy. Oh? Her smile danced dangerously through the shadows cast by the open mouth of the fire she stoked. Can you? She finished, as if not truly expecting an answer back. Well, yeah, it's a little scary and gross. He shivered at the implications of it all, not quite sure what to say or make of it. Grandy nodded slowly, replacing the metal poker to its place at the fire's edge. Grandy, no, you can't be done. What happens next? Does she escape? Does the merchant kill her too? Does she get away before the other hogs figure out what the oil's made of? Or do they figure it out and turn on her? You said she was the weakest link, or they thought she was. The woman of the woods chuckled and rustled Chester's locks as she passed. You have quite the imagination, young Master Chester. Use it well and it'll serve you well. She smiled, eyes twinkling in the firelight. Yes, that's all for now. Head downcast, he followed her to the front door, dragging his feet. We can't forget, Buck is short on help today, Master Chester, and on his end, the work often requires an extra set of sturdy hands. She offered him a basket of bundled cheese, freshly made from Betsy and the goats whose names he'd already forgotten. Chester slipped into his boots in silence, chewing on the meaning of, well, everything. We'll see each other again soon, dear one, she cooed, as he wrestled to his feet and accepted the basket of delicious smells and savory dairy treats. If Nessy is in need of rest, we may see more of each other than you bargained for. Chester grinned back, quite certain he'd never grow tired of Grandy's tales. Well, maybe I'll see you tomorrow then. He skipped over the cobblestone steps, offering a cautious glance toward the coop containing his new nemesis. Coast clear, he rushed for the fence line, waving a hand out behind him, and then disappearing through the thick underbrush surrounding the narrow path back to Willow Bay. Grandy followed him with her eyes until the last of the bushes fell still. He's a good boy, that one, she mused to the fuzzy white feline crisscrossing between her ankles. Meow. To be continued. Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like updates and notifications, hit the subscribe, like, and definitely share it with your friends if you found value in it. I hope you have a beautiful, beautiful week. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to sharing future episodes with you. Until then, take care.